अब दहर में वे यारो मददगार नहीं हम, पहले की तरह बेकसोला जार नहीं हम।
So at home with my brothers and my sister and myself was a difference in how the children were treated. Even though we were all educated, we all had to do homework and housework and everything, but still there was a difference.
My parents' only children, my brother who was older than me, so society tended to treat him differently.
Well, the women's movement is a movement where women's issues, their needs, their other problems are identified collectively.
The history of the women's movement in Pakistan is a long and tumultuous one, seldom related or celebrated. With the first demand for equality to the building of a new state, we celebrate the pioneers. When approached by Begum Jahanara Shahnawaz in 1937 to seek permission for the formation of a women's Muslim League, Jinnah stood up and replied that he did not believe in separate men and women's organizations, but in their working together from the primary league upwards. It may seem that sanction for political and social activism was gifted to women by the patriarchs of their times. The truth is, with or without encouragement, women of the subcontinent boldly broke their silence as early as the 1900s with the women's reform movement and the Anjuman-e-Khawateen-e-Islam demanding educational rights, right to inheritance, voting rights, and an end to polygamy.
At the turn of the century, last century, when the nationalist struggle began in India, you found that women came out demanding, education rights. Then went on to political participation. We have to see this as a movement which has been over a few decades and culminating in the Tehreek-e-Pakistan, the Pakistan movement.
The struggle for an independent state based on equality of the sexes, justice and tolerance as promised by Jinnah saw the largest mobilization of women, protesting against the religious conservatives and agitating against the unionist government.
So you find that every moment that there's been a political movement, women also get inducted, sometimes very consciously, sometimes they create the space themselves. It was B. Amma, Maulana Shaukat Ali Johar and Muhammad Ali Johor's mother who came out into politics because of a political struggle, the Khilafat movement.
You had many women who joined, and you have Shaista Ikramullah and others who were part of it, saying that, it seemed as if all of the boundaries had just been taken away in that period, and you could reinvent your role as women and as men.
The 1946 general elections in India saw for the first time two women leaguers, Begum Salma Tasadduq Hussain and Jahanara Shahnawaz, as candidates.
जब कारकुनाने तहरीक पाकिस्तान की तहरीक का आगाज़ हुआ है तो तब बेगमात महल्ले महल्ले में जाके मीटिंग करके मतलब करती थी और उन्हें बताती थी कभी पाकिस्तान बनेगा इस्लामी हुकूमत होगी आप क्यों नहीं आते बाहर निकले तो जो औरतें कभी घरों से निकली नहीं थी वो भी आ गई थी.
First time we had a flag which was a woman who got onto the secretariat in Lahore, a young schoolgirl, and took her dupatta off and took the Union Jack off and tied her dupatta as the Pakistani flag.
बेगमात ने दी थी गिरफ्तारियाँ तो जुलूस की शक्ल में हम उनके पास उधर गए जेल रोड पे ये औरतों की जेल हुआ करती थी जिसमें बेगम शाहनवाज, मुमताज़ शाहनवाज, सलमा तसद्दुक़ हुसैन, फ़ातिमा बेगम, बेगम करीमदा, शमीम जलंधरी, नासरा कियानी और खालदा चुगताई, इन्होंने गिरफ्तारियाँ दी हुई थी। तो उस दिन हम जुलूस की शक्ल में गए उधर, तो वहाँ भी नारेबाजी करके आ गए। तो आए सीधा सेक्रेटेरिएट, तो हज़ारों लड़की औरतें थीं, बच्चे घसीटते हुए आ रही हैं, नारे लग रहे हैं, कायदे आज़म जिंदाबाद, मुस्लिम लीग जिंदाबाद, बन के रहेगा पाकिस्तान, ला इलाहा इल्लल्लाह अल्लाहू अकबर, ये नारे थे। तो उस दिन ये मुझसे कारनामा हुआ कि मैंने यूनियन जैक उतार के मुस्लिम लीग का परचम लहरा दिया।
This country was founded on a girl protesting. That it was a very dramatic moment. The Union Jack is brought down by a girl.
The victory of a separate homeland was a sweet yet painful one. Millions of refugees flocked to the fledgling state. Homeless, sick, separated from their families, children orphaned or abducted, women widowed, raped.
After partition, there was a great need for focusing on rehabilitation. There was massive movement of people, migration, people coming in totally bereft, without their belongings, losing their families, and there was a need to address those situations. That's where women got mobilized.
The most prominent of these were Fatma Jinnah and Rana Liaquat Ali Khan.
It was Women's Voluntary Service, which came to address the issue of rehabilitation of all those people who had been dislocated, displaced.
उन्होंने पाकिस्तान बनने में जब औरतें आई हैं उनके लिए बहुत कुछ किया है। बच्चे जो इतने इतने पढ़े हुए हैं, वे यारो मददगार आके लोग ले गए। उन्होंने कहा कि नहीं हिस्सा नहीं है, ये जायदाद के मालिक बना के दिया जाएगा बच्चा। कल ये नौकर बना के ना सारी उम्र बच्चे को रखे, पता नहीं किस किस खानदान के बच्चे हैं।
All along, Fatma Jinnah was one figure that was publicly visible. Her efforts in promoting women's education, especially nursing, other professions. She was one public figure that was visible all along those years when we find there's a gap in politics. She, as a social icon of improvement for women, was there.
A little while later, in '49, you had the Prime Minister's wife, Begum Rana Liaquat Ali, setting up the All Pakistan Women's Association, APWA, which of course continues today.
This Pakistan Women's Voluntary Service converted itself into All Pakistan Women's Association. The objective at the time was to address the issues of so many new entrants into the country, their schooling, girls and women, their health.
APWA went on to become the largest social body active countrywide for women's education, economic independence, healthcare and childcare today. Though several progressive women's organizations formed post-independence, the struggle for equal rights was constantly thwarted by religious conservative opposition. Some went as far as calling the Prime Minister's wife and the ladies of APWA prostitutes for walking the streets unveiled.
The Naval Guard, the reserves, and the women were being taught self-defense, and suddenly you get all of these Maulvis who had of course opposed the creation of Pakistan but were now in Pakistan, protesting that this was completely un-Islamic, unacceptable, etc. And so the naval and guards and reserves were cancelled. And I think that was the first indication of how over history we've seen how women's rights are always sacrificed for some kind of political compromise. There were other groups. There was the Democratic Women's Association that was started by Tara Mazhar Ali in 1948. They had a greater focus, not so much on parliament, but on working class women and the oppression that they faced.
The Democratic Women's Association was a women's section of the Communist Party. But then when the Communist Party was banned, the Women's Association continued. They struggled for women workers' rights very much. The women's right to work, women's right to write as political beings, as workers. And they worked with the underprivileged groups, the labor, women from the labor classes, the poor. It was more politicized than APWA was, for instance. APWA was charity oriented. Democratic Women's Association was more political.
women now focused on getting social and political rights made part of the new state's legislature.
We should remember that women had been mobilized to participate in the struggle. There was a lot of people who felt that now that we've achieved what we were mobilizing for, the women don't need to now come out and they can now go home and be comfortable and their needs will be addressed. But these women said that, we want to be part of the political process. We want a space within the system.
When Pakistan is sort of debating what Pakistan will be about after partition, we suddenly say, well, what are we going to be? What type of a society we're going to be? One of the key questions, almost as important as whether everybody will get the vote and whether it will be a federation or whether it will be an Islamic republic, was what will be the status of women in this country. And a women's committee was formed in 1953 called the Women's Rights Committee. In other words, women's rights was always on the agenda. And in fact, it was APWA and it was women who demanded that Women's Rights Committee. That Women's Rights Committee was meant to look at law and meant to look at the rights of women for including in the first constitution. So it was always a constitutional issue.
In the face of staunch opposition from religious clerics, two very determined members of the First Constituent Assembly, Jahanara Shahnawaz and Shaista Ikramullah, managed to force the Prime Minister to pass the Personal Law of Sharia Act 1948, giving women for the first time the right to inherit property, including agricultural land.
Within the assemblies, there were only two women, but they were they really struggled for women's rights. They produced a women's rights charter within the assemblies. So their role in the Constituent Assembly was to make sure that women's rights are safeguarded in the new constitution. And they were the pioneers.
According to Shahnawaz, for instance, she feels, she expresses herself in her autobiography, she said something like, as long as we can ensure that there are women in parliament and making decisions, then we've done our job and the next generation needs to take over to ensure.
Where the women felt that they were getting marginalized, they could marshal women outside to put pressure. So that was a very interesting, we see, happening, the occurrence of women in the assembly and women outside having a compact of taking the women's struggle forward.
Suddenly, in 1955, an unwelcome incident made women groups return focus to the issue of polygamy.
The trigger for this was the second marriage of the Prime Minister of that time, Muhammad Ali Bogra. And the way APWA is structured, the wives of important people were part of APWA. So the other APWA ladies took exception to it and objected.
Starting off with a social boycott. All of the people who met and had dinner together, etc., refused to meet him. The women refused to go to receptions. So they just had a social boycott, which was sufficient to make the government uncomfortable, I presume. But Shahnawaz also had women in the streets. We had the largest demonstration at that time of women gathering outside the assembly, which was, of course, in Lahore at the time. So the Lahore Assembly was the National Assembly. And it was the one thing that united women from all kinds of classes. They did not want men to have more than one wife.
These women recommended the creation of a commission. A commission was formed in 1955, and that commission gave certain recommendations.
Now that was a time when any religion-based law was not codified, and this one too was not codified. So it was customary law that was practiced. So there was a need for codification.
The Rashid Commission had more men than women, but there were 3 women who participated in that. And the commission produced an absolutely wonderful report, which unfortunately was not entirely accepted in terms of the laws that we have today.
The commission faced countrywide opposition from religious quarters, and its report was shelved due to Maulana Ehtashamul Haq Thanvi's dissenting note.
I don't think there was any un-Islamicness to it. You had religious ulama who were sitting on the commission. You had Rashid himself was, of course, a Supreme Court justice. So with the full knowledge of Islam, jurisprudence, etc. And they repeat in their commission, in their report again and again, that there is nothing un-Islamic about this. In fact, they have at one point say that it is the duty of Muslims to look at their laws and to change them in accordance with what the circumstances is. They feel that it's a responsibility.
A 1958 bloodless coup brought in Field Marshal Ayub Khan. A westernized leader averse to religious conservatism, he had a progressive stance on the status of women.
Ayub Khan, as far as women were concerned, he was a typical sort of Sandhurst type general, and very sort of liberal and British, etc. So in that, the support for women and the opening up of spaces and whatever, it was he who passed the family laws ordinance.
The family laws are not what women desired, but they still were a very, very important step forward. First of all, for codifying. Secondly, within it were deterrents for polygamy.
The law never banned polygamy. What it did was that it required a procedure to be fulfilled before a man contracted a second marriage.
A man needed to take permission from the Union Council, who would determine whether there was any reason for him to remarry, and then get a permission to do that. Then there were many other rights of a woman were recognized, and Nikah-Nama itself became the contract on which a woman's rights could be safeguarded.
Though a small victory for women, the ordinance has since been a serious bone of contention between religious parties who believe that the law tampers with men's basic rights and women's groups.
The first session, the Maulvis started protesting all over again, saying this is un-Islamic, we will not have it. And it is the women, by and large, if you look at the debates, it is the women who stood up to what they thought was a misuse of Islam at that point. And I think we have continued with the misuse of Islam. Islam is often forwarded for anything that you don't want to do in terms of equality, in terms of democracy, etc.
This law has been controversial since the very beginning. It was enforced in 1961. All through the years, the social policy of the state has never given this law the kind of backing and support that it deserved, so that its implementation was stronger, and that there would have been more beneficial results coming out of this.
No sooner had military dictator Ayub Khan won the trust of women activists that the 1965 presidential election brought him an unpleasant surprise: a female opponent.
It was an extremely uplifting sort of feeling. I was still in college, I think I was just in college then, and one felt very good that a woman could actually stand for the election of a president. It never occurred to anyone that that is a possibility. But somehow, because we are a certain male-dominated society, and it's taken 60 years for us to now think of this as a possibility, so that way it was a very brilliant sort of move and inspiring.
General Ayub quickly rallied a group of supportive ulamas to issue public fatwas against women becoming head of state.
The fatwas were given opposing her on the behest of the president. And the president himself said that, a woman does not have a place under Islam to head a country.
In a surprise move, Maulana Maududi reversed his well-documented stance on working women and supported Fatma Jinnah's candidature.
If you look at the period of quick political changes, you found that Islam was being used and religious groups were also being used to create the numbers to counter the other. The way that campaign was run and the way power, force was used to deny her a victory, really, she should have won.
It is widely believed that the elections were rigged in favor of Ayub Khan.
अब दहर में वे यारो मददगार नहीं हम पहले की तरह बेकसो